You might think the biggest danger for a Viking warrior with his sharp axe and horned helmet, okay, they didn't actually have horned helmets, but stick with me, was a surprise enemy raid or a kraken rising from the deep. You picture epic sword fights on the deck of a longship, shields splintering, and roars that would scare the gods themselves. But let me tell you, their most constant, nagging, and deadliest enemy wasn't an army with swords. It was something much simpler, much quieter, and much, much thirstier. It was the simple, desperate need for a drink of clean water. Figuring out how to stay hydrated on a ship in the middle of a vast, salty ocean was the single greatest puzzle the Vikings had to solve. You can have the coolest, fastest ship in the world, but if your crew is too weak from dehydration to lift an oar, you're just a floating coffin waiting for the tide to take you. The secret to their incredible, world-changing voyages from the rivers of Russia to the shores of North America wasn't just about building amazing ships. It was a genius-level system of planning, technology, and pure grit designed to beat the ultimate boss, thirst. Let's get one thing straight right away. The popular image of a Viking crew just pointing their dragon-headed prow at the horizon and sailing for weeks and weeks into the big, empty blue? That's mostly a fantasy. Trying to do that would have been a catastrophic, bone-dry failure. It would be like trying to drive a car from New York to Los Angeles without a map and with only a single can of gasoline. You're not going to make it. The real genius of the Vikings wasn't in enduring impossibly long voyages. It was in being smart enough not to attempt them in the first place. They were the absolute masters of the strategic road trip. They played a game of connect the dots across the ocean, and this strategy was the absolute foundation of their water supply. Imagine you're a young Viking, maybe on your first big voyage. You're nervous, excited, and you're looking at the vast, intimidating expanse of the North Atlantic. The grizzled old captain, a man whose beard has more sea salt in it than a barrel of pickled fish, gathers the crew. He doesn't point to a far-off spot on a map and say, "We'll see you in a month." No way. He points to a much closer spot. "We sail for 2 days," he'd grunt. "Then we hit the Shetlands. We'll fill the barrels, rest the men, and maybe trade for some wool. From there, it's another day and a bit to the Faroes. Another stop, another refill." This wasn't a single terrifying leap into the void. It was a series of smaller, manageable hops. It was island hopping, not ocean crossing. Do the math. The trip from their homeland in Norway to the Shetland Islands was maybe a day and a half of sailing. From there to the next chain of islands, the Faroes, was about the same. The longest, most common open water stretch from the Faroes to the wild shores of Iceland was still only about 2 or 3 days at sea. This changes everything, doesn't it? The problem isn't how do we carry water for 30 days? The problem becomes how do we carry water for 3 days? That's a much, much easier puzzle to solve. This whole strategy was born from the design of their incredible ships. Viking longships were the Ferraris of their time. They were long, sleek, elegant, and breathtakingly fast. They had what's called a shallow draft, which is a fancy way of saying they didn't sit very deep in the water. This was their tactical superpower. It meant they could pull off surprise raids by sailing up shallow rivers where bigger, clunkier ships couldn't go. It meant they could land their entire army on any random beach. No port required. They were the ultimate amphibious assault vehicles of the ancient world. But every superpower comes with a price. The price for all that speed and agility was a serious lack of storage space. They didn't have the deep, cavernous cargo holds that later medieval ships would have. They couldn't just stack hundreds of massive barrels of water and food below deck because there was no below deck to speak of. They were basically sitting on a beautifully carved high-performance raft. So what did they do? Did they build slower, fatter ships with more storage? Heck no. That would be like telling a race car driver to trade in his Ferrari for a minivan. Instead of changing their awesome ships, they changed their entire approach to travel. They used their incredible navigation skills, reading the sun, the stars, the flight patterns of birds, even the movement of whales, to create a network of watery highways across the ocean, a series of sea lanes that were dotted with their own natural God-given gas stations. It was a brilliant solution that played to their strengths and made their biggest weakness almost irrelevant. Of course, even for a 3-day trip, you still need to carry your water in something. You couldn't just hope for the best. And the Vikings had a whole system of specialized containers, a kind of ancient Tupperware collection designed for the roughest kitchen in the world, the open sea. The backbone of this system was the good old-fashioned wooden barrel. But these weren't just any barrels. They were masterpieces of engineering, built by highly skilled craftsmen known as coopers. Being a cooper was a seriously respected job. Anyone could nail a few planks together to make a box for carrying rocks, but making a barrel that could hold liquid without leaking a single drop, all while being bashed around on a stormy sea, that took real artistry. These coopers were like wood wizards. They knew exactly which type of tree to use. The best choice was white oak, because it has this weird cellular structure that naturally blocks water from seeping through. It's like the wood comes with its own built-in waterproofing. The cooper would carefully shape the staves, the long curved pieces of wood, so they fit together with incredible precision. Then came the hoops. We think of barrel hoops as being made of iron, and sometimes they were, but often Viking coopers would use flexible, tough wood like ash or hazel, twisting them into tight rings to hold the whole thing together. But here's the really clever part, the bit of natural magic that made it all work. Wood swells when it gets wet. A cooper would build the barrel to be tight, but once it was filled with water, the wood itself would expand, squeezing all the joints together even tighter, creating a near-perfect seal. It was an incredibly smart design that used the laws of nature to its advantage. On the biggest ships, they didn't just have barrels. Archaeologists digging up incredible, well-preserved Viking ships that were buried as tombs for great chieftains have found enormous wooden troughs. We're talking about something like a giant bathtub carved out of a massive log, capable of holding hundreds and hundreds of liters of water. This was the ship's main reservoir, but you couldn't have 40 thirsty Vikings all trying to dip their cups into one giant trough in the middle of a battle. So they had a distribution system. The old stories, the sagas the Vikings told around the fire on long winter nights, talk about a lidded bucket that stood by the ship's mast. This was the communal water cooler. Any crewman could go there for a drink. When it started to get low, someone would have the job of refilling it from the bigger barrels or troughs that were stowed and lashed down elsewhere on the ship. It was a simple, practical, two-tiered system: bulk storage for the voyage and a smaller, easy-access container for daily use. But it wasn't all about sharing. A Viking was defined by his personal gear, and while he had his axe and his shield, he probably also had his own personal water bottle. The most common type was made of leather. It was called a leather flaska, which just means leather flask. They were made from tough, vegetable-tanned leather, hand-sewn with strong waxed thread to make the seams waterproof. Then, the whole bottle would be hardened and sealed, maybe by boiling it or coating it in beeswax. The result was a container that was lightweight, almost impossible to break, and easy to sling over your shoulder. It was the perfect piece of personal equipment for a sailor who needed to be able to grab his gear and jump into a fight or onto a beach at a moment's notice. Living on an open-deck ship was a constant battle against the elements. It was wet, it was cramped, it was chaotic, and every single inch of space was precious. This is where you see the true genius of Viking design, in how they made single objects serve multiple purposes. The absolute best example of this is the sea chest. This wasn't just a boring old box. The sea chest was a Viking's entire world on the water. First off, it was his seat. The men sat on their own chests to row. Second, it was his personal locker, where he kept his extra clothes, his tools, his share of any treasure, and any other personal items he had. Third, it was designed from the ground up to survive at sea. It had a curved, rounded top, like a little roof, so that the constant sea spray and rain would just slide right off instead of soaking in. It had angled sides, making it wide at the bottom and narrower at the top, which gave it a stable base that wouldn't tip over easily as the ship rolled and pitched in the waves. But the most brilliant feature of the sea chest was its little feet. The bottom of the chest was always raised several inches off the deck of the ship. Why? Because the floor of a Viking ship was always wet. There was a constant sloshing mix of rainwater, sea spray, and whatever else got spilled, all collecting in the bottom of the ship. They called it bilge water. By raising the chest up off the deck, a Viking could ensure that his precious belongings inside stayed safe and dry. It was his seat, his locker, his footrest, and his personal dry dock all in one. It was the Swiss Army knife of furniture, a perfect, elegant solution born from the harsh realities of life at sea. This whole system of planned stops and smart storage was their Plan A. But any good sailor knows that Plan A often goes right out the window the moment a storm hits or the wind dies. The Vikings were survivors, and they had a whole range of backup plans for finding water when they were stuck out in the middle of nowhere. Their most reliable backup plan came straight from the sky: Imagine a crew becalmed for days. The sun is beating down, the sea is like glass, and the water barrels are getting dangerously low. The men are getting weak, their throats are parched, despair is starting to set in, and then on the horizon, a smudge of gray, a cloud. The mood on the ship would change in an instant. It would be an explosion of frantic, joyful activity. The ship itself would transform into one giant water-catching machine. The main tool was their massive square sail, which was usually made of thick, oily wool that was pretty water-resistant. The crew would work together, adjusting the ropes and rigging to angle the sail just right, turning it into a massive funnel. They would place every single barrel, bucket, and container they had on the deck beneath it. But they were too smart to just start collecting the first drops. They knew that the sail was caked in weeks of dried salt spray from the ocean. The first few minutes of a downpour would be used to give the sail a good bath. A crewman would be stationed to taste the runoff, spitting it out until the salty taste was gone. Only when the water running off the sail was finally sweet, as they called it, would he give the shout. "It's good!" And the crew would start collecting the precious, life-saving fresh water. You can just imagine them in a big storm, a scene of organized chaos, with Vikings running around with their helmets turned upside down to catch a few extra mouthfuls, or wringing out their thick woolen cloaks into a bucket. They wouldn't let a single drop go to waste. Their resourcefulness didn't stop with rain. They sailed in some of the most extreme environments on Earth, and they learned to find water in the unlikeliest of places. On their voyages to the far north to Greenland and what they called Vinland in North America, they would have encountered a truly incredible source of fresh water: icebergs. These colossal mountains of ice, which had broken off from ancient glaciers, were made of pure, compacted snow. They contained no salt at all. A Viking ship could pull up alongside one of these floating water fountains, and the crew would get to work with their axes, chipping off huge chunks of the crystal-clear ice. It would have been dangerous work. Icebergs can be unstable and can roll over without warning, but the reward was an almost unlimited supply of the purest, coldest drinking water you could ever imagine. In the foggy, misty regions of the North Atlantic, they might have used another trick. On a cool night after a humid day, condensation, or dew, would form on every surface of the ship, especially the big sail. A diligent crew could collect this moisture, wiping it off with cloths. It wouldn't be much, but when you're desperate, every single drop counts. Now, if we're going to get a complete picture of how Vikings stayed hydrated, we have to look beyond just water. In fact, for most of the crew, plain water might not have even been their main drink. They had a whole menu of other beverages that they carried with them, drinks that were a direct and delicious extension of their life back on the farm. The two most common drinks you'd find on a Viking ship were ale and mead. Ale was the everyday beer brewed from grains like barley. Mead was a sweeter, stronger drink made by fermenting honey with water. These drinks had several massive advantages over a barrel of plain water. First, the alcohol from the fermentation process acted as a preservative. Ale and mead would stay good for much longer than water, which could quickly turn into a disgusting, slimy soup of algae and bacteria in a warm, sloshing barrel. Second, and this is just as important, these drinks were packed with calories. Rowing a 40-man long ship across the North Sea was back-breaking, calorie-burning work. The men needed a constant source of energy, and ale was a way to both hydrate and refuel at the same time. It's time for a little myth-busting. You've probably heard someone say that people in the old days drank beer and ale because the water was dirty and the alcohol eliminated the germs, making it safer. That's a nice story, but it's not really accurate. The everyday ale the Vikings were chugging was probably what we'd call a small beer. It had a pretty low alcohol content, maybe just 2% or 3%. That's not nearly strong enough to eliminate any serious disease-causing bacteria. The reason ale was safer than some water sources wasn't the finished product, it was the process of making it. A key step in brewing is when you take the liquid from the mashed grains, known as the wort, and boil it for a long time. This boiling is what would have sterilized the water, eliminating off any germs that might have been in it. So it was the brewmaster, not the beer itself, that made it safe. But perhaps the most important and most overlooked drink in the Viking maritime diet was something far less glamorous than ale or mead. It was a sour, cloudy liquid called whey. Whey is the byproduct of making cheese. After you curdle milk and strain out the solid curds to make cheese, the watery liquid that's left behind is whey. In the pastoral, farm-based economies of places like Iceland, where raising cattle and sheep was everything, whey was produced in huge quantities, and they discovered that if you let it ferment a little, its natural acidity would preserve it for a very long time. This stuff was a nutritional super drink. It was packed with protein, vitamins, and minerals. On a long voyage, especially a settlement voyage where they were bringing their livestock with them, whey was a constantly renewing source of a safe, nutritious beverage. They would often mix it with water to make it more palatable, creating a drink they called blanda. It might not have been as fun as mead, but this Viking Gatorade was probably responsible for keeping countless settlers alive on their grueling journeys to new lands. So you see, their entire approach to hydration was tied up with their approach to food. They didn't just pack ship's food. They packed a mobile, preserved version of their entire farm. They had dried fish and meat, they had flour for bread, they had cheese, and they had the drinks that came from that same system. Ale from their grain and whey from their milk. It was a holistic, incredibly efficient system where nothing was wasted. The process of making cheese, a solid food for the voyage, automatically produced whey, a liquid drink for the voyage. It was a closed loop of survival. But even with all this brilliant planning, technology, and resourcefulness, life at sea was still incredibly dangerous, and the biggest dangers were often the ones you couldn't see. A Viking longship was a petri dish, a perfect incubator for disease. Even if the water was clean when it came from the stream, after days of sloshing around in a wooden barrel in the sun, it could become a breeding ground for all sorts of nasty things, and the ship itself was crowded. You'd have 40 or more sweaty Vikings packed into a very small space, living and sleeping side by side. On settlement voyages, they would bring their animals with them. Chickens, goats, maybe even a cow, all crammed in there with the people. The potential for germs to spread was enormous. This leads us to a fascinating puzzle, the Viking hygiene paradox. Were they filthy or were they surprisingly clean? It depends on who you ask. We have an account from a 10th century Arab traveler and diplomat named Ibn Fadlan, who spent some time with a group of Rus Vikings. He was absolutely disgusted by them. He wrote that they were the filthiest of Allah's creatures, and he described in graphic detail how they would all share a single bowl of water in the morning, passing it from person to wash their faces and, horrifyingly, blow their noses in. To him, coming from a culture with strict rules about ritual washing with clean running water, they were savages. But then you look at what English writers from the same period were saying, and you get the exact opposite story. They complained that the Vikings were too clean. They griped that these Danish invaders were annoyingly vain because they bathed every single Saturday, combed their hair daily, changed their clothes regularly, and were always preening themselves. This, the English writers grumbled, made them unfairly attractive to the local women. And the archaeology backs this up. Viking graves are full of personal grooming tools, ornate combs carved from bone, little tweezers for plucking unwanted hairs, and even tiny, delicate ear scoops for cleaning out earwax. So what's the truth? Were they gross or were they fresh? The answer is both. It was all a matter of cultural perspective. By Ibn Fadlan's standards, they were filthy. By the standards of 10th century Europe, they were practically dandies. But the most important point is this: they had zero understanding of germ theory. They had no idea that invisible microbes could cause disease. So even a practice that seemed clean, like everyone washing their hands in a communal bowl before a meal, could become an incredibly effective way of spreading a stomach bug to the entire crew. So their personal hygiene was a strange mix of clean and dirty and a constant risk for disease. But all of those dangers came second to the most fundamental challenge they faced every single day at sea: the desperate search for a safe drink. But what about food? How did they keep their food from rotting on the open sea, with no fridge, no salt? Click here to find out how Vikings preserved food on board their ships.